Thank you for everyone sharing. We're going to do this every time because we want to celebrate what God is doing, and God is working through small steps. Because the steps when you share it that feel small, they're not small when you're in the middle of doing it, right? Like when you walk across the street and you're not used to walking across the street, like it's a big step. But in the grand scheme of someone's spiritual journey, like there are these small steps that we take that are outsized in significance because of the way that God will use them. So we're just going to keep pressing. Like you will. What's the phrase? You'll replicate what you celebrate. Is that the way that the phrase goes? Something like that. Yeah. Just it's like I said that first. I'm the one who said that. We're gonna keep celebrating those steps. So keep leaning in. If you got a Bible, Matthew 5, you can turn there. Tonight we're going to talk about our discipleship target. For those of you who were here last time, those of you who are new for the first time tonight, you're off the hook. But for those of you who were here last time, we ended with a challenge, and the challenge was to listen to a sermon from John Tyson. And I hope that you've had a chance maybe over dinner to discuss that a little bit. But it's a sermon that is really encouraged and challenged me in my own faith, in my own ministry, in my own thinking about discipleship and mission. And one of the quotes that he leads with early in this message is this quote on the screen from Neil Cole. It says, "Ultimately, each church will be evaluated by only one thing: its disciples. Your church is only as good as its disciples. It does not matter how good your praise, preaching, programs, or property are. If your disciples are passive, needy, consumerist, and not moving in the direction of radical obedience, your church is not good." Now that might feel kind of harsh, but I think if you read through the Bible and just with an honest take on it, you will get to see really clearly that a lot of times the direction and trajectory of the way Jesus is intending to shape his people is very different than what we settle for. And so when John Tyson, he titles that sermon a radical minimum standard. And what we want to establish for us in these early days of Hill City Church is a radical minimum standard of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. That word disciple, depending on your church context, might be one that you're either really familiar with or really unfamiliar with. A disciple is simply a student or a follower of Jesus. In fact, what you'll notice is if you go through the New Testament, the word Christian is used very infrequently. In fact, when it's first introduced in the book of Acts, people start calling the early church movement Christians. It was pejorative. It was a negative statement. They were using it to make fun of the followers of Christ. You don't see the word Christian very often. What you do see is the word disciple. People who are dedicated to following and to becoming like and then to doing what Jesus as the discipler did. And so I shared our mission earlier. It's to multiply disciples who bring good news and good works to Rock Hill. Like really, if we're going to just shorten that, what do we want to do as a church? We want to bring good news and good works to Rock Hill. That's what we want to do. That's what we want to be about. We want to be people who have the good news of the gospel on our lips and who demonstrate the transformative power of the gospel through our lives, good works. But in order to do that, you might say, oh, how do you do that? Well, the answer is we have to be a church that takes discipleship seriously. There's 80,000 people in Rock Hill. If you expand beyond that into York County, the number gets into the hundreds of thousands. And the percentage of people who are even just nominally, like they took a survey and said they were a part of a church, it's like a quarter of the population has any meaningful connectivity to an evangelical. We would say like the gospel is present in this church. Now, what I know, and hopefully you know, is that out of that number who would say, I go to this church, the number of people who actually know and follow Jesus is that much smaller. Which means that probably out and about in Rock Hill, Fort Mill, wherever you live, the chances are 1 out of every 5 people that you meet actually has a relationship with Jesus. Now, what's the answer to reaching the other 4 of those people? Is it you invite them in to hear me or Darren preach? Is it that they have to come through the doors of a church building? Well, certainly that could play a part, right? That could be a part of the process. But I think the vision of the New Testament is followers of Jesus who are so transformed by Jesus that they then live a life that is different and that begs questions out and about in the places where you live, learn, work, and play, so that people see your good works, as Jesus would say, and glorify your Father in heaven. And so when we talk about a discipleship target, what we mean is this is the engine of Hill City Church. This is the focus of what we're going to be all about. So when it comes to like, well, is Hill City going to have this kind of program or these kinds of events or these kind of things? The filter we are constantly going to be using is, this is our discipleship target. Does that program help us to make these kinds of disciples who live in this kind of way? If the answer is no, then we're not doing it. We are going to be laser focused on discipling you and anyone who comes through our doors to be the kind of people who follow Jesus faithfully into all the places where he's put us. And so we see a standard of discipleship in this key, it's like a vision text that we've used for Hill City. It's in Matthew chapter 5, if you've got it pulled up. I'll put it on the screen for you if you don't have it. And beginning in verse 13, well, quick context. This is a Sermon on the Mount. Okay, so Sermon on the Mount, most popular of all of Jesus' sermons. And most of the time, even for me, like when I think Sermon on the Mount, you think he's on the mountaintop and there's these just crowds, thousands of people who are around him. It's why it's one of the most famous sermons. He's preaching to the crowds. But what you'll actually notice is early in the text, before the Sermon on the Mount starts, what it says is that Jesus called his disciples to him. The context of what's actually happening is Jesus is calling his disciples to him, and he's preaching first to them. And then the crowds are only in a secondary way being addressed through the sermon that's being preached. What does that mean? What's the significance? Well, context is king when you read the Bible. You can't just pull it out and make it mean what you want it to mean. What I think that means is that if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, then these become uniquely targeted at your heart and at your life in a way that wouldn't necessarily be true if you're not a follower of Jesus. It would be an invitation if you're not a follower of Jesus. It's an evaluative tool if you are a follower of Jesus. So this is what he says in verse 13. Jesus speaking to his disciples and through them to the crowd. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt should lose its taste, how can it be made salty? It's no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city situated on a hill cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, but rather on a lampstand, and it gives light for all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. So here's what I just want to call out quickly, and then we're going to shift to how Hill City would define our discipleship target. And just, again, context is king when you read the Bible. Sometimes context is king so you understand like what I'm thinking and why we're doing this tonight. Over the next several of our gatherings together, we're going to be diving into different elements of what a disciple of Jesus is and the types of disciples we're trying to make at Hill City. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing over the next several weeks. Tonight is just kind of the intro overview of that, all right? So that's the context of what this is. But before we get to defining a little bit more clearly, like what's our language going to be as a church for how we describe a disciple, I think it's helpful to go from the text and say, what is a biblical view of discipleship? So here are 3 things we see really clearly in this passage. Now, there are many more things you could say that are true of discipleship. But at the very least, we have to say that these things are true. First, disciples are distinct. Someone who follows Jesus is distinct from someone who does not follow Jesus. So he uses the image of salt and the image of light. All right, so both salt and light are defined by their distinctiveness from their surrounding environment. Salt is distinct from an otherwise bland food in the flavor that it adds to the food. right? Light is distinct from darkness in the way that it brights it up. It changes the entire environment. Jesus is calling disciples salt and light in this way, that when we, in our lives, followers of Jesus, when we are in the world, there should be such a flavor and a beauty and a goodness of our lives, like that's definitive, it's distinct in our lives, that other people see it and they know there is something different about it. If you are truly a disciple of Jesus, you will be distinct from the world. Does not mean you will be perfect. It simply means you will be on a trajectory where your attitudes, your habits, the things that you value, the things that you prioritize, the things that you love, the things that you do will ultimately be on this trajectory of being distinct. So the implication here is that a worldly disciple is an oxymoron. Y'all know what an oxymoron is? Anybody pay attention in like middle school literature class? I didn't. I had to learn this after the fact. So I'm trying to make sure my kids learn things now. An oxymoron is where you put two words together that otherwise seem like contradictions, right? So like an example would be jumbo shrimp, right? That's like the classic oxymoron. Jumbo and shrimp are opposite words, but we put them together. In my household, I might say quiet toddler. Oxymoron, they don't go together. Panthers, Super Bowl, you get the idea. It's so a person who blends in with the world's attitudes, priorities, behaviors, value system is not in a biblical sense a disciple of Jesus. Hear me. Like this is Jesus. This is the book. This isn't like I'm making this up. I'm just trying to call us back to the standard that Jesus gives us. Which means I think you need to ask yourself, if you are not distinct from the world, are you really a follower of Jesus? I think it's a question we got to constantly be asking ourselves. And frankly, the reason why this is so important where we live, learn, work, and play is because we live in the South. We live in the Bible Belt, where everybody and their mama knows Jesus and believes in Jesus, at least on Christmas and Easter, right? We got to get underneath that. And we got to have a different evaluative grid on what Christ is calling us into. So the first thing is that disciples are called to be distinct. The second thing is that disciples are visible. Disciples are visible. So light, what does it do? It reveals, it shines. All right. So when he's talking about light, he's talking about a lamp set on a table. It lights up the whole room versus a laser pointer, which just directs light in one tiny little spot. Actually, I think this has a laser pointer. Look at that. You see the difference? That's a laser pointer. If you weren't looking directly at this, you wouldn't see this. Whereas a lamp lights up the whole room. And what he's saying is the idea of our faith is that as a disciple of Jesus, our lives are supposed to be like these lamps. They light up the world around us. And in this point, that people, because they can look at our lives and they can see what is true about God through us. Our lives have an illuminating factor about them. When people look at your lives, do they see the truth about who God is? That's a tough question to really get down and to ask. The other thing that we see here is, by implication, is that an invisible disciple is a contradiction. Here's what I mean by this. If nobody knows that you are a believer and a follower of Jesus, are you truly a believer and follower of Jesus? You see, the implication that Jesus is putting before us here is that while faith must always be personal, right? Like your mom's faith, your grandma's faith, your husband's faith, your wife's faith, like whoever's faith got you in the door, it's not going to make the difference in eternity. It's your faith. It must always be personal. But while faith must always be personal, it can never be private. Christ has called us to a personal faith that always is lived out publicly. So when we start thinking about discipleship, the kind of disciples that we want to make, right? When we're thinking about this, we want to make disciples whose lives are beautiful, who are distinct, who are different. Bible word might be righteous. Bible word might be holy. We want to live lives that are distinct and different. And we want to live lives that other people see, and that in this third way, bring other people to know him. So that third point is disciples are sent. Verse 16, that is the verse that I just think God has really put on our hearts for Hill City. Let your light so shine before others that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. People see your tangible love for God worked out in love for other people in simple, simple ways. And the effect, Jesus is saying, is that it plays a part in God's mission in the world to bring people to glorify Him. Now, the mission that God is on, the story, we talked about this last time, and if you weren't here last time, we'll link this video. You can check this out next time. But there's a story that God is telling in the world about His glory. He's created the world, and He's going to recreate the world through Christ when He comes again, so that all of creation resounds to the praise of His glory, which means that one of our key value statements has to be God's glory is greater than my story. I'm going to stop living my life and inviting God into it, and I'm instead going to start asking, what is God doing, and how can I, in my life, in the places, the relationships that I have, how can I bring glory to Him, rather than making this me-centered story that I'm trying to live? What you'll find is that you become free the more you find yourself a part of His story, as opposed to making all of the world revolve around you. Jesus says that in this mission of God, He actually uses us, like broken, jacked up people who are imperfectly trying to follow Him. We're stepping in the potholes of our own sin and struggles and mishaps and proclivities, personality-wise, and all the different things that we have going on. And He says, yet when you keep your eyes on me and you focus on me and you follow me, your life is going to be so different that all those little steps that you take in love towards other people around you, going across the street, I'm just going to keep picking on Lily because it was such a big step, going across the street to talk to the new people on the block, right? Like whatever it is. And God is going to use that as a deposit that's far bigger than the action that you just took. And it's actually potentially going to lead to a person glorifying God for all eternity. The truth that we want to keep impressing upon this group is that the flowers of fruitful evangelism grow best when planted in the well-tilled soil of a life marked by good works. If you've been following Jesus for a long time, my guess is you probably feel a little guilty by the amount that you do or don't evangelize. That's true for me. Most of us know, we're supposed to share the gospel with people, and we all just feel guilty about it because we don't do it. And for some of us, we don't know how to do it, and that's why some of us were shy. But we, generally speaking, it's not the fact that we know we're supposed to do it that we're missing out on. It's not like we're ignorant of it. I think one of the biggest hindrances at times is we think we got to go straight for spiritual laws with someone, or we got to be able to pull out the Romans road and walk somebody through a track. That's that moment. And if we're not doing that, then nothing else counts. And what I want you to hear is that actually fruitful evangelism 90% of the time is really just you learning to be a friend. It's really just you learning to be the kind of person who can listen to somebody when they're going through some hard stuff, whose life has been trustworthy enough through repeated exposure in environments that are non-threatening, and maybe it's a fire pit behind your house, maybe it's lunch around the table at work with some coworkers, whatever it might be. But it's these little building blocks that is the ground for fruitful evangelism. I think the point to get here is that your life should raise questions that only the gospel can answer. Now, I think this is incredibly important when we talk about context. It's this fact, is that you don't become a disciple of Jesus by first doing these things. We try to clarify this the first go around when we talk about good works. This is not you do these good works, you live a distinct life, you just white knuckle your way to living this way, and then you become a disciple. You need to remember the context here. Jesus has already called these people disciples. By virtue of His invitation, follow me, they became His disciples. Now He's giving them the standard of a vision of what it looks like to follow after Him. And the same is true for us. You don't become a disciple of Jesus by just trying to be distinct and just trying to live your faith out more visibly and by trying really hard to do all these things. That's not the process. Jesus calls you to be a disciple by trusting in him and repenting of your sin, turning away from it, trusting that he died for it. But now, what you have to understand is that once you come to him and he calls you his disciple, you have to discern, am I actually living into his vision for discipleship, or am I settling for a lesser vision of discipleship that I've established for myself? Or that maybe culturally in the South has become acceptable? Jesus' vision of discipleship is this. He wants disciples who are distinctly Christ-like, intentionally outward-facing, and tangibly good in their loving actions towards others. But we tend to settle for a vision of discipleship that is much weaker. It's one that is preference and convenience-based. It's insular. It's relegated to Sunday mornings or private devotional times or perhaps a weekly or bi-weekly small group Bible study. And it's one where we can ultimately be apathetic towards our influence on outsiders. We could walk by people made in the image of God and not think twice about where they might spend eternity. Now, why does this matter? Why does this matter for us? Well, number one, I'll just continue to put this in front of you. I grew up with this version of faith. They did their best, but I grew up with this vision of faith that was basically the list of things I needed to do for God to be pleased with me. And I believed I needed Jesus for my sins, and I think in that way it was legitimate. But then the rest of it was just this to-do list. And if I didn't hit the to-do list, then God was like the coach on the sidelines who I looked over at in the middle of the game and just had his arms crossed and was just kind of like looking at me like this. Like, I knew he loved me. I'm still on the team, but he's kind of like, you could do better, God is not, in calling you to a higher vision of discipleship, is not trying to keep you from the good life. When he says to live this way and to live distinct from the world, he's not saying, yeah, you can't do all the fun stuff that the world gets to do. Just suck it up. It's not going to be fun. You're going to hate it, but you got to do it. No, Jesus said that I come to give life and to give it abundantly. So why does this matter? Why does this vision of discipleship? It matters because if you settle for a weak, low, worldly view of what it means to follow Jesus, you're robbing yourself of all that God has for you. Secondly, you're robbing the people around you from potentially seeing Christ through you by lessening your vision of what God might be calling you to in your life. And then lastly, and most importantly of all, to stay hidden as a disciple is to rob God of the glory that he deserves and might otherwise get through your fully surrendered life that might lead to other people around you coming to know him and glorifying him as well. So the stakes are high. The stakes are high. And you'll notice at no point yet have we actually talked about anything that we could put in the category of quote-unquote church. This is about you and Jesus. Now, the vision of the church as we start building this together over time is that Jesus doesn't call us to just be us and Jesus individually. He calls us to be all of us together with Jesus running in the same direction. And that's where there's real power. Jesus is worthy of glory. And the whole story is going to end with him being praised. I think it's really important to recognize as well, nobody starts at this point of really deep discipleship. So the disciples, when Jesus calls them up in Matthew 5, you realize that's Matthew 5, like he just called them in Matthew 4. There's a whole bunch of experience that was about to come their way. I mean, Peter was still he was going to deny Jesus. He was going to slice some dude's ear off. Like, those jokers had it wrong. They had a lot of growth to do. And yet they're still disciples. Here's what I will tell you. Don't hear the standard as being so high, because Jesus is the one who sets the standard. I'm not like trying to articulate something. I'm trying to, like, that's different. I'm trying to articulate in modern terms what Jesus is saying. Jesus is setting a really high bar, a vision of discipleship. But the point isn't to say, man, that's so high. I'm so far away from that. I guess I might as well just quit or I'm not welcome. No, the point is to say the vision is that high, you can never do it on your own. Isn't God's grace amazing that He would invite you to journey in and to become that? Isn't God's grace amazing that He's actually going to work in you by His Spirit to transform you into wanting to do that, into wanting to live that kind of life? Now, so the point is, no matter where you're at today, you can take a step into this journey of discipleship. God only uses broken, sinful people to become His disciples. So the starting point ultimately is the same for all of us. And so the invitation, when we start thinking about this discipleship target, being distinct, being visible, being sent, the invitation today is to take a step towards being salt and light. We've tried to frame core rhythms in a way that make it really tangible and practical, concrete, how you can take a step living as salt and light. Now, when you think about the way that the Bible will talk about a follower of Jesus, there's a whole lot that we could say. Now, what I've learned is that as a church, it's really important to try to use language that's concise enough and compelling enough and memorable enough, and maybe most importantly, that it's replicable. That it's something, when we start thinking about what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus, that it's not just something that you can grow into, but that you can take to someone else to help them become a disciple of Jesus. Because remember, what is our mission here? What does Jesus say in Matthew 28? He says that our mission as a church is to go and to make disciples of all nations. Which means that if you are a disciple of Jesus, you are sent to go and to make disciples. Every single one of us. So we need to, as pastors, as elders, we have to give you language and the ability and training, equipping to be able to not just become disciples, but to become disciple makers. Which means we have to help you understand a framework that is easily transferable and replicable. That you could go to lunch with a coworker, or you could be at the ball fields talking to someone who is a parent of one of the kids on the team, whatever it is, and that you could draw a diagram, or that you could have a conversation about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. So we've tried to do this, and we've tried to put it in a way that has a really high target that captures a lot of big categories of what Scripture would talk about, but gives some handles for us in ways that moves us towards simplicity. So our discipleship target, the way we are going to summarize this at Hill City Church, is basically through the lens of three identities that we see are true of a disciple or a follower of Jesus in Scripture. A disciple of Jesus is a worshiper, a family member, and a witness. A worshiper, a family member, and a witness. And we've just created a diagram that puts this all together, because what we wanted to help you understand that this is not a linear thing. Now, I've seen some different people do this different ways. Every church has this burden of trying to figure out how to articulate and disciple people. And sometimes it can feel like it's really linear. Well, first I've got to figure out how to become a worshiper. Then I have to figure out how to serve in the church and how to have community. And then I got to figure out how to serve out into the rest of the world. And then if I ever mature enough to get to it, I'll become a witness where I share the gospel with somebody. But that's just backwards. If you look in the New Testament, in the Gospels, the people who shared the gospel first are the people whose lives had just been transformed by Christ. They didn't go to a Bible study or an equipping class first. That John Tyson sermon, he quotes a statistic from a study that Southern Baptists did, which showed, I think he said, that it takes a regular church attender 26 years before they would ever lead one person to Christ. 26 years of faithful church attendance. Man, that's too long. So what we want to help you do is let's grow towards all of these things at one time. Now you'll see the way that we've broken this down is every triangle has 3 core practices around it. So as a worshiper, we would say 3 irreducible practices of growing in your worship of Jesus that you would surrender to him is prayer, Bible reading or study, and obedience. Jesus say, if you love me, you will keep my commands. Not, I'm going to love you when you keep my commands. But if you love me, it'll work its way out and surrender like that. So we would say that those 3 things are what are part of becoming a growing worshiper. If you want to grow as a family member in the church family, and membership is going to be a thing that for some of you at Hill City Church is going to look different than anything you've experienced in a church body, because we're actually going to call you to be a member relationally, not just on a roll where we've checked your name that you can, some membership, it's like, what does that even mean? Like, I can vote on something every 5 years or so. It's like, what? We're not talking necessarily about organizational things, although there's a component to it. We're talking about actual committed relationships to one another in membership, where there's encouragement and comfort and care, but also there's accountability. And accountability is something that a lot of us would say that we want, but the moment we get it, we kind of hate it. I know, I hate accountability the moment that I get it. And then it's only afterwards that I'm like, yeah, I needed that. I needed to hear that. I needed to hear that truth. And actually, I feel loved now that I've received that from somebody. So we would say, and as a family member here at Hill City, you commit to some things. You commit to gathering. Man, when we gather, we're family. I don't know about you. If I just say, hey, I'm going to miss this family get together, like my parents, the extended family, everybody's getting together, that's not going to go down too well. Like, not only is it going to be like, why do you not value us? Like, I'm going to miss out on the time together. So like, we just hope like gathering together, grouping together in smaller groups, giving your time, talents, and treasures. These are things that mark being a family member. And then finally, witness. When we think about witnessing, we witness in 3 spheres. To your nearest, that's people in your home, your roommates, to your neighbors, and to the nations. Now, these next several gatherings, we're going to take each of these individual triangles and we're going to dive deep onto each of them. Because what we want to do is we want to set our mark on these are the things that Christ has called us to. And so we want to together be focused on becoming these kinds of people. That's very different than just trying to start a certain kind of worship service. When we get towards the summer, into the summer, we are going to start talking a lot more about worship services and serving, like all the things that need to happen to take place there. But I have little interest in just starting a new kind of worship service if we're not living out a biblical vision of discipleship before we get there. Does that make sense? Like, Rock Hill doesn't need just another church with a slightly different flavor of worship that reaches existing Christians. We need a new church that is discipling people to live out a biblical faith on mission, all the places where you live, learn, work, and play. Now, with that, one of the things we're going to do every single time we come here is that we're going to take time now to focus the last 10 minutes to think about our ones. So I defined it earlier. Your one is someone who is close to you, but far from God. And if you were here last time, what we did is to give you a chance to just go as a practical step. Hey, go write their initials or their name and your initials or their first name, like on a sticky, and let's just have it there as a visual every time we come. And my hope is that these are going to get more and more full as we go towards September. And my hope is also this. My hope is that we get to a point where we're crossing some off. And I think about the way we celebrated some of the storytelling of steps. Man, I hope we go freaking crazy when we have an opportunity at some point to share, hey, my one came to Christ last week. And we get to cross that name off the list. Like, don't you want that? So here's what I want you to do. These remaining 10 minutes, I want you to gather around some people. If you have not taken the chance to write the first name of your one, go find a place. There's a marker on the floor. go write the name of your one. Then just circle up with a few people. Pray out loud that God would give you opportunities and that those people would come to faith. And then I'll come up and close us out right at like 7. Sound good? All right. Let's do it.